Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Boris. And thank you very much to all of the organizers of tonight's event. I've been in Austria for about a week, and I've been quite overwhelmed both by the level of political activism, by the warmth and solidarity of people working on these incredibly important issues. I have to apologize when you hear that my mother was born in Floridsdorf. You would assume I would manage to speak in German. But unfortunately, I could probably manage one sentence in German. So I apologize for the fact that I have to speak in English. But as recompense for that, you'll be glad to hear that I speak incredibly slowly. Not specially for you. I just do when I speak publicly. I don't know why. It might have to do with working with Nelson Mandela, who spoke notoriously slowly. The other thing I have to say is that I don't like sitting down when I speak. And so you'll also have to excuse me if I move around a little bit. And that comes from a number of things. One of which I think I spoke about in Linz when, right after we were elected as the first democratic government in South Africa in 1994, I was asked to go on a trip we were making to America and to Cuba. The Americans tried to stop us getting on the plane to Cuba, but we still went. And we went to Atlanta, Georgia, which was the home of Martin Luther King Jr. And when we arrived, the mayor of Atlanta was there to greet us. He was a former professional basketball player who might have just fitted in here. He felt to me like he was about 10 foot tall. And he greeted us because Atlanta is home to the headquarters of the Coca-Cola Corporation. So he greeted us behind a lectern that was an illuminated Coke can. And when he'd finished, my boss, who was a guy called Tokyo Sachwale, said to me, "Andrew, you just go and respond." So I walked up the back of the Coke can and I said a few words and I came back down. I said to Tokyo, "Chief, was that all right?" He said, "Yeah, what you said was fine. It's a pity all we could see was a very shiny bald head sticking out of a Coke can." So I think that has something to do with it. And then on my last speech in Parliament, because I actually only resigned from Parliament, I never resigned from the ANC. So that whenever I criticize Thabo Mbeki or Jacob Zuma, two of our former presidents, one of whom is on trial for corruption, and I'm supposed to be going in April to give evidence against him, although he'll have a doctor's note to say he's sick the day before the trial, which he's been doing for years. They always say, Feinstein, as a disciplined member of the ANC, knows that he must make his complaints in his branch, not publicly. Now, I've never been a disciplined member of anything, first of all. And second of all, my branch is the London branch, which doesn't exactly have a direct link to the presidency. So I'm not sure what making my complaints to my London branch would actually do or achieve. But when I was giving my last speech in Parliament, because I resigned the night before they were going to kick me out, the Speaker of Parliament was very angry with me because I'd revealed this huge corruption scandal, a big arms deal, where we spent $10 billion on weapons 4 years after we became a democracy. Weapons that we didn't need and that we've barely used until today. Why? Because during our constitutional negotiations, before our election, executives from the world's largest arms companies were there. And they told Thabo Mbeki, who they knew would effectively run the government day to day, and a chap called Joe Modise, who was our first post-apartheid defense minister, that a huge arms deal was not only a good way to keep the white generals, who didn't like this idea of democracy very much, it was a good way to keep them happy. But more importantly, it was a very good way to fund your political party. And this is crucial to understanding the global arms trade, as I'll talk about it in a moment. So the speaker who tried to stop me investigating was very angry with me. And I wasn't being very polite about her in my last speech, because I was arguing that she had failed to uphold her duty to do what is in the best interests of our parliament, and had rather listened to the president who wanted the investigation into corruption stopped. And we used to have a lectern in our new parliament that the speaker could move up and down. So when you have a short speaker like me, it was here. When you have a tall speaker, it's up here. The problem was, as I was giving my last speech, she was moving the lectern up and down. And my notes were sort of sometimes disappearing, and then they'd be around my ankles. It was driving me mad. So I think that maybe has something to do with why I don't like speaking behind anything. So this book, now let me see if I can find, probably won't be able to find it. Monstrous Anger of the Guns is a title that was suggested to us by one of the people involved in the production of this book, Vijay Prashad. Now, I don't know if any of you know Vijay's work, but if you don't, he is really worth reading and listening to. Just Google his name. Vijay, to this day, is still a member, I was going to say, of the Indian Communist Party. But India has so many communist parties that I'm not sure which one he's actually a member of. But he is still the member of one of the Indian communist parties, and is one of the most brilliant commentators on the state of the world, and particularly on the reality that we are finding so difficult to grasp at the moment, which is that, yes, Vladimir Putin is not a good guy. He ordered the murder of 3 journalists I used to work with. It's the one place that, in research for my previous book, The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade, I couldn't travel to Russia because I'd estimated that Putin has made about $44 billion personally out of his cut of arms deals in the time that he's run Russia. And I believe, and some of you might be disappointed to hear this, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal. That doesn't mean it was unprovoked. That doesn't mean that NATO behaved well, that Zelensky, who, by the way, is himself deeply corrupt. Have you ever heard of the Pandora Papers, a big leak of financial information? This man, who claimed to be penniless when he became president, had $1.4 billion stashed away offshore in only one leak. So that's only one institution. Who knows what other money he has stashed away? Who, despite being Jewish, seems to quite like neo-Nazi militias. These sorts of things are not black and white. They're not just good and evil. I wish the world was that simple, but it's not. China, a huge economic power, very influential in the continent I come from, Africa, very influential in parts of South Asia. Do I think the Chinese regime is great? No, I don't. But the insight that Vijay brings in his chapter in this book is that the West is no better, and in fact, in some respects, is worse. Which is the country that spends more than the next 6 countries on what it calls defense, what is actually war and conflict? Which is the country that has invaded more other countries since the end of the Second World War than any other, and been involved in more conflicts than almost all other countries put together since the Second World War? Not China. It's not Russia, it's the United States of America, who gave its citizenry the choice in the last election of one militarist who, and I don't mean any disrespect by saying this, seemed to me to be on his deathbed. I mean, he struggled to string a sentence together, but thought he could still stand for the presidency. This is the arrogance of America's corrupted politicians. And a guy who, in any functioning state that is governed by the rule of law, would have been in jail years ago. And you can take your pick as to what you could put him in jail for. Be it his physical and sexual assaults against women, be it his remarkable corrupting of all sorts of state officials in New York to ensure that he managed to develop the real estate he did. A man who's been declared bankrupt 7 times. This is the best choice that the most powerful nation on the earth can give its citizens? And we think we should all bow down to the state? I live in the United Kingdom, where we supposedly have the mother of parliaments. My goodness, the mother's kids who are sitting in that parliament are the most remarkable bunch of corrupt, mendacious, mediocre people I have ever seen gathered in one place at one time. My own MP is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. The only good thing about him is that we don't have to guess when he's lying. It's every single time his lips move. And this is a former human rights lawyer who, on being elected leader of the supposedly centre-left Labour Party, what is the first thing he proclaims on being elected leader of the Labour Party? And the guy's not Jewish. I am a Zionist without qualification. Excuse my language. Is your daughter in the room? Okay. But what the fuck does that have to do with being leader of Britain's Labour Party? This is a guy who has announced in the last week an increase in defence expenditure of £13.4 billion a year. At the same time as announcing a cut in spending on our National Health Service of £7 billion a year, and today the announcement that there will be a £6 billion cut to welfare benefits. And this in a country that has more billionaires than at any time in its history, but also more families having to use food banks to feed themselves than at any time since the end of the Second World War. And this is a model for us? It has the mother of all parliaments, but it uses anti-terror legislation to imprison climate activists and people who think that Britain arming a genocide is not a good idea. I have friends who are serving 5, 6, and in one case 12 years in prison. That's not a democracy. That's an oligarchy, where you are only allowed to think in a very narrow way. And if you think within that narrow way, then you're great, you're fine. You can do whatever you want. But if you think outside of those confines, you're a terrorist. And you certainly can't write an editorial in Jeff Bezos's Washington Post, because all editorials in that newspaper now have to be supportive of individual freedom and neoliberal capitalism. That was once a great newspaper. Now we can use it for toilet tissue. That is the state of the world into which this book came. So, we did the book with something called the Peace and Justice Foundation, which is the foundation of a guy called Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy is a close friend of mine for decades because he was very active in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Jeremy came within 2,300 votes of becoming Prime Minister of Great Britain. And it caused such alarm to the British establishment that a senior general in the British Army suggested that if Corbyn actually somehow won this election, despite, according to the London School of Economics, the media misrepresenting 74% of everything he said. 2,300 votes he came within. But this army general said to the media, if somehow Corbyn wins the election, the military will have to consider a coup. And just in case we didn't get the idea, soldiers, when they were on the rifle ranges practicing, used pictures of Jeremy Corbyn to fire at, someone running to be Prime Minister of their country. That is the state of our democracies in the West. So the great insight that Vijay has in this book is that we are uncritical of our democracies at our peril, because it is a debatable point whether they qualify as democracies. In my opinion, quoting the brilliant American journalist Greg Palast, in the West, we have the best democracies money can buy. And crucial to understanding how our democracies are bought and paid for is understanding the economics of the global trade in weapons. Now that might sound a little bit weird. So let me explain. This trade is the most corrupt of all trades in the world. It accounts for 40% of all corruption in world trade. 40%. Why? The deals are worth tens of billions of dollars. There are only a few of them every year. Well, that's changed in the last 2 years, but usually. They are concluded by very, very small numbers of people. And everything that happens on these deals happens behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy. So on the most corrupt transaction in human history, something called the Al-Yamamah deal between Britain and Saudi Arabia, £6 billion of bribes were paid. Not complicated bribes, just money. £6 billion. But not all of those bribes went to members of the Saudi royal family for buying the weapons from Britain. Some of them went to the son of the British Prime Minister who signed the deal, a complete wastrel called Mark Thatcher, who was given £12 million. He wasn't involved in the deal at all. His mother just insisted that he be given some of the bribes because he's incapable of doing anything in his life. Except he once got lost in a desert in Africa in a car. That's about his greatest achievement so far. I met this horribly arrogant, remarkably stupid man because he came to live in South Africa. And then he was convicted and found guilty on 2 charges in South Africa and deported. He put money into a coup in Equatorial Guinea, which is illegal in South Africa. And he started a business where he was charging police personnel over 1,200% on loans. And he illegally arranged with the police department that before police were paid, he would get the money the personnel owed him. So we had a whole lot of police who at the end of the month got a salary check of 0 because Mark Thatcher had taken their entire salary. It's what we call loan sharking. And again, it's illegal in South Africa. So this brilliant, brilliant son of the then Prime Minister was deported from South Africa. The person who was most excited by that was his ex-wife. Because of his criminal record, he couldn't travel to the United States of America. So she took their 2 children and moved back to America. So they didn't have to have contact with him. I was still in Parliament, so it must have been 2001. I think he was deported 2004. So, Mark Thatcher gets £12 million. The various intermediaries, the arms dealers or brokers or agents, depending on the role they play, they get tens of millions. The executives who agree to pay the bribes on these deals, like the chief executive of Britain's biggest arms company, BAE Systems, a chap called Sir Richard Evans, because all of Britain's most corrupt people get knighthoods. He was given an apartment in central London in Mayfair that today is worth over £60 million. Thanks for paying us all these bribes. We'll make you quite a bit richer too. But then, and most importantly, the biggest arms dealer involved in the transaction was a guy called Wafik Saeed, Syrian-born. Mr. Saeed, who once sent me a letter, quite a rude letter, but I think the paper on which the letter was written probably cost more than I earn in a month. It was so lovely to touch and to feel, and so thick, I don't know how many trees had to be cut down for that piece of paper, that even if it hadn't been from an arms dealer, I would probably have kept it. Mr. Saeed, after whom the business school at Oxford University is named, because in Britain we celebrate our most corrupt people. Mr. Saeed gave thousands of people in Britain money from the bribes so that these people, could give that money to Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party. Because in Britain, unlike in the United States of America, individuals can't just give however much money they want to a politician or a political party. In America, I describe the system as legalized bribery. In Britain, it's illegal bribery. So he ensures, through multiple people, that the Tory party gets millions of pounds in legal donations. And this is crucial to understanding the global arms trade. This corruption fuels, oils the wheels of our political systems in the West. And it's not just the political parties that benefit. It's not just the so-called captains of industry that benefit. It is also our individual politicians. So, politicians, military leaders, intelligence leaders who are all involved in this trade, when they leave office, they go and serve on the boards of all of these arms companies. But they get what they describe as a golden handshake for joining the company. Anywhere from £500,000 to, in one case, £7.5 million, just for turning up, in addition to what they're going to be paid on a regular basis as board members. So they know if they make the right decisions while they're in office, they will make millions and millions of pounds as soon as they've left office. And in the case of the Prime Minister, let's take the example of Tony Blair, while a Labour leader described by Margaret Thatcher as her greatest political achievement, because she managed to turn the Labour Party into a neoliberal, warmongering party, no different to the Conservative Party, so that it didn't matter who was in government. Until, of course, Jeremy Corbyn came along with this ridiculous idea that maybe we should increase taxes on the wealthiest. Very radical ideas. No one had ever heard of them. That maybe we should stop selling arms to undemocratic countries. Whoops! Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, no weapons for them. But excluding Jeremy, if the two main parties are identical, we can go through the facade of elections in which fewer and fewer people vote. Doesn't matter. Because whichever party's in power, what they offer us is the same. They don't tell us this, but permanent austerity and forever wars. And part of the reasons for those forever wars are that this is how they finance themselves. So Tony Blair, I very conservatively estimated, and I haven't updated this estimate for 3 or 4 years now, but I estimated a few years ago that he had made a minimum of £110 million personally since leaving office from his decision to invade Iraq and his association with British arms companies. But at least once a week, Tony Blair burps, and it's on the front page of the Guardian newspaper. Because absolutely complicit in this system is that our media have stopped doing their job. Why? Well, because if one looks at the 4 or 5 biggest financial institutions on the planet, BlackRock, Fidelity, State Street, Vanguard, they own the majority of shares in the biggest defense companies, in the biggest fossil fuel companies, in the biggest tech companies. Gee, and here's a surprise. In all of our commercialized media companies. So we're getting exactly the same messages from our media as we get from our politicians. So, what is central to this system, this profoundly and systemically corrupt system, is that our defense budgets have to increase all the time. Because if they don't, there isn't enough money to go around amongst this global national security elite. And of course, for our defense budgets to go ever higher, we need conflict. So, even while the madmen in the White House, who didn't like the fact that the Biden family has been making a fortune out of the Ukraine for decades, because he has a much better relationship with Putin and has made money out of Russia. So now that he's decided America won't support the Ukraine, and the EU and all of our governments are now in a state of total confusion and don't know what the hell to do, what is our response? To negotiate peace between Russia and Ukraine? And to find a negotiated solution to the contested territories? Which, by the way, was offered to Zelensky 2 years ago. And Boris Johnson and Joe Biden persuaded him not to even engage in those peace negotiations. Of course not. It's to increase defense spending in the EU by 800 billion euros. And to increase defense spending in each of our individual countries, just like we've done in the UK. Why? Because neoliberal economics have ensured that our economies are incapable of growing. So now we have these defense-led growth strategies, which, let me tell you how that worked out for South Africa. When we spent $10 billion on weapons, over the next 16 years, while we were paying off these weapons, which we were told was going to bolster our economic growth to levels we'd never seen before, our economic growth declined by about 1.3% of GDP. They were going to create 94,000 jobs. They created a negative 70,000 jobs. That's how good defense spending is for growing your economy. But that's what we've decided is going to grow the economies of Europe. But it's almost Orwellian, because if we look at what is happening in Gaza, war is peace, escalation is de-escalation. So I think growth can be the contraction of our economies, because that's how our politics works now. So that is the context in which this book takes place. And yes, as I can see from your faces, it's a little bit depressing. It's not like a fun story. And there ain't no gold pot of money at the end of the rainbow. We haven't even got a bloody rainbow. So it's going to be a fun read. Bizarrely, it is. Why? So the subtitle of the book starts with a depressing book, How the Global Arms Trade is Ruining the World, which is what I've just told you about. And I should add to that, this great desire of ours to resolve conflict through negotiation, through diplomacy, is reflected most starkly in the reality that today the government of the United States of America, well, what's left of it, after a racist South African, who in his exuberance makes Nazi salutes at inappropriate moments, and in case we're not sure whether it was actually a Nazi salute, he gives the keynote speech at the AFD meeting 2 days later, just in case anyone might have not been clear. And he's just cutting the American government to nothing, putting hundreds and hundreds of thousands of families on the streets. This lovely man, Elon Musk, hasn't, however, taken the knife to the reality that the American government employs more people to run one aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire world. Now, that would be bad enough to show that America has absolutely no interest in diplomacy. But in fact, it gets worse, because America today has 12 aircraft carriers. That's how focused on diplomatic resolution to conflict the United States of America is. So the second half of the subtitle, it's not just about how the global arms trade is ruining the world, is what we can do about it. And this gets a little bit cheerier. Not entirely, but a little bit. A little bit. I'm trying here. So, we do talk about the impact of the trade in the book. And there are extraordinary chapters on militarism and climate, because you might want to just mention to your Green Party, and you might also want to pop across the border to Germany and mention it to theirs too, that you actually cannot campaign for the environment and support conflict in the way that they now do. Why would that be? Well, because nothing is more damaging to the environment and to our climate than conflict. The Pentagon is the single largest institutional polluter on the planet. The worst fuel that there is on the planet is jet fuel. 27% of all jet fuel used in our skies is used by military jets. Conflict causes massive dislocation of populations that have a devastating impact on the environment. Gaza is not somewhere, despite Donald Trump's despicable AI video, that you're going to go and plant fields that you hope grow, because of the pollutants and the chemicals that are now embedded into that destroyed land. So there's a brilliant chapter on militarism and the climate emergency where we talk about the military boot print, what the real emissions are, because our militaries don't even have to tell our own governments how much pollution they're putting into the environment. We talk about the arms trade in Gaza through a brilliant chapter by a friend of mine called Ahmed Al-Nawak, who lost 24 members of his family in one bombing. We talk about Yemen, where Western weapons sold to Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been used in war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law for almost 10 years now. We talk about the impact of the trade in Uganda, in India, and across Latin America. So that's not so cheery either, really. So do we have a cheery bit in this book? Well, actually we do. Because part 3 of this book is called Global Campaigns Against the Global Arms Trade. And I'll tell you something. As these chapters were coming in and I started reading them, I suddenly started to feel such a sense of hope. Because there are people doing the most amazing things against the arms trade. In localities I wasn't even aware there was an anti-militarist movement. So, how many of you knew that there is a thriving independence movement in Hawaii? I thought there were just surfers in Hawaii. Turns out there are more American military bases in Hawaii than surfers. And America stole the island of Hawaii for one purpose, for those military bases. It wasn't because whoever the president was at the time, Herbert Hoover or whoever, was very into surfing. But there's this amazing, amazing independence movement. And its roots are entirely anti-militarist. And the impact that it's had has been extraordinary, and I was completely ignorant of this. There's a great chapter about the Stop the War movement in Britain that arose as a consequence of the largest ever human protest in Britain against the Iraq War, that has now been surpassed by the number of people marching against Britain's complicity in the genocide in Gaza. We have hundreds of thousands of people turning up on the streets every second weekend in London. And you know what we do on the alternate weekend? We have demonstrations locally. So where I live, it's outside Keir Starmer's office. Of course, Keir Starmer hasn't been anywhere near that office in the 10 years he's been our Member of Parliament. But there's a picture of him on the door. So we have a vague idea who the hell he is. Then there is a chapter by a group called Palestine Action, and this is really important for tonight's meeting. These people who are absolutely extraordinary. Elbit Systems, a key factory in Israel's military-industrial complex, had 10 factories in Britain. Quite why, I don't understand. Today they only have 7 because Palestine Action has forced the permanent closure of 3 of them. Palestine Action has caused the company to lose a £280 million contract with Britain's Ministry of Defence. Many of them have landed up in jail. Far more have won their cases where magistrates have decided that they committed a minor crime in order to prevent a far greater crime. What else is direct action? So, in order to stay on the right side of the law in Austria, let me say that during the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, the most powerful weapon we had to weaken the apartheid economy was boycott, divestment, and sanctions, what we know as BDS. And the reality is that just as BDS liberated apartheid South Africa, so will BDS be crucial in liberating Palestine from apartheid Israel. And there's a brilliant chapter on the best BDS strategies written by Palestine Action. Workers against the arms trade. We have seen in Italy, in France, in Spain, in South Africa, we have seen workers at the docks refusing to load weapons onto ships because they're destined for Israel. So there's a brilliant chapter by an Italian trade unionist talking about how this movement has been engendered around Europe and around the world. Student campaigns against the arms trade from something called Demilitarized Education in the UK that is organizing on all campuses across the UK. Strategic litigation against the arms trade, where we don't win cases, because judges always say, well, the executive arm of government has responsibility for national security and defense, and we are not going to second guess them. So even if they're breaking the law, what you're saying is the law doesn't apply to them. Because arms export laws are broken every single day by our governments. The European Common Position on Arms Exports is violated every single day by our governments. The International Arms Trade Treaty is violated every single day by our governments, and there are no legal consequences. But what these strategic litigation cases do is they bring these matters to the attention of the public. And even our supine commercial media reports those cases. And then, as I mentioned, the campaign to end the militarization and occupation of Hawaii. So what this tells you is that in what feels like a very bleak picture, there are amazing people all over the world who are organizing, campaigning, taking direct action to reverse the militarism that is so destroying our world. And that is what should give us hope. And that is what we need to do here in Austria. It is what we need to do in Britain, in South Africa. And how do we do that here? Well, the most obvious starting point is a military embargo. How on earth can our governments gainsay the export to or the import from Israel any form of military or dual-use equipment when Israel is engaged in a genocide. That should have been the starting point on the 8th of October. South Africa's military embargo cost the country so much money because we had to pay such a massive premium to get arms. And one of the key people violating that arms embargo was Margaret Thatcher's husband, Dennis. Sorry, I feel as though I'm picking on the Thatcher family tonight. Oh, tell me about it. They did the world a great disservice in so many ways. And Mark is still around. They never mention the daughter. Did you know that Margaret Thatcher also has a daughter? Why don't they mention her? Because she's queer. And because according to her mother's laws, she wasn't normal. And she didn't have the same legal protections as those normal people. So we never hear about Carol Thatcher. We only ever hear about Mark Thatcher. And Carol actually has a brain, which is another reason we probably don't hear about her. It's out of character for the family. And you don't need me to say this. You know this better than me. All of our struggles are interconnected. And it's so important that we understand and we campaign against all of the discriminations, the disadvantages that we face. But that we also don't lose sight of the fact that as much as with these issues of our personal and political identities stand material marginalization. Because sometimes we lose the class element of our struggles. And here's a reason to keep class at the forefront of our struggles. Because this isn't a competition about who of us is discriminated against most. But there's an extraordinary thing that Vijay describes in the book going on in the Ukraine. Middle-class Ukrainians and wealthy Ukrainians aren't fighting the war with Russia. They've got out of the country. They're in places like Britain. But now Keir Starmer wants working-class Britons to go and fight in the war against Russia in the Ukraine. So at the roots of militarism is the roots of material and class marginalization. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. But what this book does is it talks about the very tools we can use, and I hate to use this word, but to fight back. Because those that control power in the world, the executives, the financial institutions, the politicians, who are sort of the middle managers, they're not going to give up power because we write good books or because we protest enough. We are going to have to take power from them. And the most exciting thing that is happening in our world is that in many places, people are starting to fight back as they realize their vote is meaningless, as they realize their ability to make ends meet gets more difficult with every passing month, as they realize more and more of their money is going to fight wars that they don't want to be fighting, is going to ensure that we have a system that provides socialism for corporations who get more government benefits than any of us ordinary citizens get. And the thing that inspires me and that gets me out of bed every morning is the extraordinary people I work with around the world, some of whom have written in this book, who are doing this work, who are, in the words of one of the organizations, taking back what is ours. And I always like to end by just reminding you of two things that my former boss, Nelson Mandela, said. First of all, he was asked in one of his first interviews after he emerged from 27 years in an apartheid prison, he was asked, how on earth did you keep your spirits up? And he said, because I knew victory was certain. And the interviewer sort of looked at him and was about to question his mental health. And he said, because the reality is, I learned in my life, it is only impossible until we do it. And that's how we won our partial liberation in South Africa. By millions and millions of South Africans and millions of people around the world, making our country ungovernable, collapsing the economy of the apartheid state, just like we will do with Israel. And the reason I end with Israel is not just because we are entering the 17th month of the world's first ever live-screened genocide that is making a lot of corporate executives, a lot of political parties, a lot of politicians, and of course a lot of defense companies incredibly wealthy. But because Mandela also said when he emerged from prison, not that, okay, everything's great now, I'm free. But instead, he said, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people.